Today's story takes us to 1970s Germany, where a young woman named Anneliese Michel became the center of one of the most chilling exorcisms in history. After suffering violent fits and terrifying visions that doctors couldn't explain, her family turned to the church in desperation. As the exorcisms began, Anneliese's screams filled the room, and those present couldn't shake the feeling that something truly evil was at work. Was it possession, or was there another darker truth? If you're a fan of true crime, tales of haunting and mystery, then you've come to the right place. We upload twice a week, so make sure to subscribe and turn on all notifications so you never miss a story. And tell us in the comments which haunting tale you'd like to hear next. Now, let's dive into today's chilling story. Anneliese Michel grew up in a small Bavarian village in post-war Germany, surrounded by the strong influence of the Catholic Church. From an early age, her life revolved around prayer, religious education, and a deep sense of devotion. Her parents, devout Catholics, believed that faith was the foundation of a moral life, and Anneliese embraced their teachings wholeheartedly. However, beneath the surface of this pious upbringing was a persistent pressure to achieve spiritual perfection, a burden she would carry throughout her short life. By the time she reached her teenage years, Anneliese felt an overwhelming sense of duty to live righteously. She avoided anything that might be considered sinful and constantly worried that her thoughts or actions might offend God. This need to be good was not just about faith. It became a source of intense anxiety. The line between religious devotion and fear of divine punishment grew thinner with each passing day. She confessed her sins frequently, sometimes obsessing over minor mistakes, such as missing a prayer or feeling envy toward a friend. To her, these slip-ups felt like betrayals, not just to God, but to herself. Her struggles with self-worth deepened when, at the age of 16, she experienced her first medical episode. During school, she suddenly lost control of her body, collapsing in a fit of convulsions. Confused and frightened, Anneliese woke up in the hospital, where doctors diagnosed her with temporal lobe epilepsy, a neurological disorder known to cause seizures, memory lapses, and hallucinations. Although the doctors assured her that medication would manage her symptoms, Anneliese sensed that her suffering had a deeper meaning. Why, she wondered, was she being afflicted this way? Had she somehow failed God? Despite taking prescribed anti-seizure medication, her symptoms persisted. Anneliese began to experience terrifying visual disturbances, shadowy figures that would appear in her bedroom, whispering cruel words she couldn't ignore. Sometimes, these hallucinations made her question if the people around her were really there. These experiences were deeply unsettling, leaving her exhausted and anxious. She isolated herself, withdrawing from social activities, fearful of judgment and embarrassment. Her parents, initially hopeful that treatment would improve her condition, grew increasingly concerned. Her inner turmoil also led to unsettling behaviors. At first, she simply punished herself for perceived failings, praying for hours without rest, or kneeling on hard surfaces until her knees were bruised. However, as her mental state deteriorated, these behaviors grew more extreme. She would wake up in the middle of the night and intentionally sleep on the cold floor, believing it was a form of penance. Other times, she deprived herself of basic comforts, like food and warmth, convinced that she needed to suffer to purify her soul. As the seizures and hallucinations continued, Anneliese's sense of identity became increasingly fragmented. She began questioning if she was cursed or if an evil presence had taken root within her. The medical explanations offered little comfort. How could something as clinical as a brain disorder account for the overwhelming darkness that haunted her mind? To Anneliese, her suffering felt like a spiritual battle, a test from God that she had to endure, no matter the cost. As Anneliese entered adulthood, her mental and physical state deteriorated rapidly. The seizures became more frequent, and no combination of medications seemed to control them. But what disturbed her most were the terrifying visions and voices that invaded her mind. These were not just hallucinations. She believed they carried a message, one that filled her with fear. At first, it was the faint sound of whispers, but soon they grew louder and more hostile. The voices accused her of being unworthy, insisting she was beyond redemption. They told her she had failed, that her soul was lost. The once devout girl, who had cherished her faith, began to experience deep confusion. Praying, which had once given her comfort, now seemed impossible. The voices mocked her when she tried, telling her that God no longer listened. She avoided church, even tearing up prayer cards and damaging crucifixes in frustration. It was as if everything sacred that had once anchored her life now felt distant and unreachable. Her behavior became increasingly erratic. In moments of panic, she would lash out, not knowing how to cope with the overpowering emotions inside her. She withdrew from her family, spending long hours alone in her room, unable to find peace. Sometimes she would pace back and forth or sit for hours in silence, lost in the storm of thoughts that never seemed to quiet. What frightened her most was the sense that she no longer had control over herself. Her family tried their best to help, but the changes in Anneliese were overwhelming. She refused to eat regular meals, not because of a lack of hunger, but because she believed that depriving herself was the only way to cleanse her spirit. The voices told her that she did not deserve comfort or nourishment. She began to experience strange impulses, behaviors she couldn't explain, but felt compelled to follow. She might suddenly throw herself to the ground, feeling as though her body was not her own to command. Night after night, her sleep was interrupted by vivid nightmares of grotesque creatures and apocalyptic visions. Some nights she awoke in tears, convinced that her prayers had damned her instead of saved her. Other times, she felt a compulsion to make herself physically uncomfortable, lying on the cold floor despite the warmth of her bed, or kneeling for hours until her legs trembled. These acts were not intended to harm, but felt like punishment she deserved. She hoped that, through suffering, she could find forgiveness for whatever unseen sin haunted her. The hallucinations worsened over time. Sometimes, she saw figures she described as demons' twisted shapes with burning eyes, lurking in the corners of her vision. She would scream and cry out to her parents, terrified by what she believed were real entities surrounding her. Her mother would try to comfort her, but nothing seemed to ease the fear. Even when the apparitions disappeared, their presence lingered in Anneliese's mind. She believed these beings wanted to destroy her from within, and no amount of medical treatment could stop them. Doctors urged the family to remain patient, insisting that her symptoms were caused by her epilepsy and possibly a developing mental illness. Yet the Michel family was losing hope. Every new medication seemed to come with side effects that worsened Anneliese's suffering exhaustion, mood swings, and feelings of despair. They began to suspect that what tormented their daughter went beyond science's understanding. Meanwhile, Anneliese herself grew more convinced that her affliction was not a medical problem, but a spiritual one. She told her parents that the medications were useless because she was not sick in the way the doctors thought. Something evil, she believed, had taken root inside her, and only faith could drive it out. She spoke of hearing names in her mind, figures she identified as Judas, Nero, and others condemned in Christian tradition. These presences taunted her, making her believe she was trapped in a battle for her soul. By the time Anneliese's condition reached its breaking point, the Michel family had exhausted every medical option available to them. Each visit to a neurologist or psychiatrist ended with a prescription for new medications, anticonvulsants, antipsychotics, but nothing relieved Anneliese's torment. As weeks turned into months, her parents began to believe that something far beyond medicine was plaguing their daughter. They were devout Catholics, and it became increasingly difficult for them to ignore the possibility that Anneliese's suffering was spiritual. not merely medical. Anneliese, too, had abandoned hope in medical explanations. She insisted that what controlled her wasn't a disease, but a dark force. Her strange behavior and outbursts now carried a sinister weight. She claimed that malevolent beings inhabited her, whispering blasphemies and urging her to reject everything good in her life. The voices were relentless, taunting her and telling her she was destined for ruin. At times, she felt she couldn't even pray because the words became twisted in her mouth, as if the darkness within her was interfering. Her family sought the advice of local priests, hoping that the church could offer the help that doctors could not. However, the priests were cautious. Official exorcisms were rare and required proof that the afflicted person's condition could not be explained by illness alone. The priests advised the Michels to continue with medical treatment, but Anneliese's worsening state left them feeling helpless. Each passing day revealed new signs of her struggle. She would refuse meals for extended periods, explaining that it was part of a personal penance, or spend hours staring at religious objects, visibly distressed as if in conflict with herself. Despite these alarming signs, most of the clergy remained hesitant. However, Father Ernst Alt, a local priest, became deeply concerned about Anneliese's condition. He believed her suffering was unlike anything he had encountered before. After meeting with Anneliese, he noted the strange shifts in her personality moments where she seemed possessed by an overwhelming rage, only to collapse moments later, apologizing and sobbing uncontrollably. Father Alt that these episodes were more than medical symptoms. He suspected that something spiritual was taking hold of her. The priest's belief was further cemented by Anneliese's growing resistance to sacred items. On several occasions, she recoiled from crucifixes as if in pain and was unable to enter chapels, insisting that an unseen force was blocking her. Father Alt urged the family to pursue an exorcism, believing that it was the only way to save her. He explained that exorcisms were not quick fixes. They were difficult rituals that required time, endurance, and faith from everyone involved. But if her condition truly stemmed from a spiritual affliction, the ritual was their only option. To perform the rite, however, they needed formal permission from the diocese. Father Alt, along with another priest, Father Arnold Renz, documented Anneliese's worsening symptoms and sent a request to Bishop Joseph Stangl. After reviewing the case, the bishop granted approval for the ritual Romanum, the official rite of exorcism. The priests were instructed to follow strict guidelines, ensuring the ritual was performed with care and precision. Anneliese welcomed the news of the exorcism. By this point, she was utterly convinced that she was being consumed by something evil, and she saw the ritual as her only hope for salvation. She told her parents that the demons inside her claimed they would never let her go, but she believed that through suffering, she could defeat them. Anneliese began to view her suffering not just as punishment, but as a form of sacrifice. She believed that her trials could help cleanse others, perhaps even atone for the sins of strangers she had never met. Her family was equally desperate for a solution, no matter how difficult it might be. They believed that the exorcism would be a path to healing, though none of them could have predicted the toll it would take. Anneliese's condition had already pushed them to the edge emotionally, spiritually, and physically. Yet, the promise of deliverance gave them a glimmer of hope that perhaps, at long last, their daughter could be freed from the torment that had consumed her life. But with that hope came fear. They knew the ritual would be grueling, and they worried about what it would do to Anneliese's fragile body. The priest warned them that the exorcism might provoke violent episodes and that there were no guarantees of success. But for the Michels, this was their final option. Medical treatments had failed, and time was slipping away. All they could do now was trust in the power of their faith and in Anneliese's belief that salvation was worth any price. In the fall of 1975, the first exorcism session began inside the Michel family's modest home. The room dimly lit by candles and filled with religious artifacts, carried the quiet heaviness of fear and hope. Father Arnold Renz and Father Ernst Out led the ceremony, reciting prayers from the Ritual Romanum, the ancient text used to expel evil spirits. The atmosphere was tense, every word of the prayer heavy with expectation. Anneliese sat in the middle of the room, her hands trembling in her lap, waiting for the first confrontation with whatever force held her captive. From the very beginning, the sessions were harrowing. As the priest prayed over her, Anneliese's demeanor shifted rapidly. At times, she appeared peaceful, mouthing along with familiar prayers. But soon after, her voice would change, becoming low, hoarse, and full of malice. She would thrash violently in her chair, growling and shouting words she claimed weren't her own. It was as though multiple personalities had taken control, each one angry and defiant. She identified these voices as belonging to notorious figures like Judas and even darker beings, insisting that they lived within her and refused to leave. The exorcisms were physically and emotionally draining, not only for Anneliese, but for everyone involved. The priest and her parents often had to restrain her when she would throw herself onto the floor or bang her head against walls, driven by impulses she couldn't explain. Despite their efforts, Anneliese's physical condition began to deteriorate. Her body, already fragile from the months of self-denial, grew weaker with each passing session. She was unable to keep down food, convinced by the voices that she must reject earthly nourishment to complete her mission. The priest tried to encourage her to eat, but Anneliese refused, believing that her suffering was necessary for salvation. Each exorcism session lasted for hours, sometimes stretching late into the night. Her parents were horrified by what they witnessed, Anneliese's voice shifting into guttural tones that didn't sound human, her body convulsing uncontrollably, and her skin breaking out in unexplained marks and bruises. Yet there were brief moments of lucidity when she would beg her family to continue the ritual, insisting that she could feel the darkness being forced to the surface. Her parents clung to these moments, believing that Anneliese's suffering was bringing her closer to freedom. They prayed alongside the priests, sometimes holding her hands as she trembled, and whispered that she could feel herself slipping away. To them, each session, no matter how excruciating, was a step closer to reclaiming their daughter from the grip of evil. Over the course of 10 months, more than 60 exorcism sessions were performed. Anneliese's condition worsened with each one. She rarely slept, her nights filled with haunting visions that left her gasping for breath. During the day, she would pace the house or sit silently, lost in her thoughts, her once bright personality reduced to a shadow of its former self. As the rituals dragged on, the demons seemed to resist with greater intensity. Anneliese would scream for hours, her voice cracking from exhaustion. She would mock the priests, taunting them with obscene language, daring them to continue. The priests remained resolute, believing that the intensity of her resistance was a sign that the exorcism was working. They prayed louder, reciting the sacred words over and over, hoping to wear down whatever force held her captive. The toll on Anneliese's body was undeniable. She became severely underweight, her limbs weak and trembling from exhaustion. Her knees were swollen and bruised from hours spent kneeling in prayer, her voice hoarse from constant screaming. Yet she refused to stop. She believed that her suffering was part of a larger plan, that by enduring these trials, she was helping to save others from spiritual harm. To Anneliese, this was no longer just about her freedom, it was a sacrifice for a higher purpose. Despite her family's pleas for rest, Anneliese insisted on continuing the exorcisms. She begged her parents not to abandon the ritual, even though they could see her body was slowly giving out. Her mother often cried during the sessions, watching helplessly as her daughter endured what seemed like unbearable pain. But Anneliese would always reassure her, saying that it would all be over soon, that she would be free. even if it meant surrendering everything she had left. The priests, too, struggled with the emotional weight of the situation. Father Renz and Father Alt spent countless hours in prayer, asking for strength to continue. They knew that Anneliese's condition was worsening, but they believed that abandoning the ritual would be tantamount to giving in to the forces they were fighting. The line between faith and desperation blurred, and the priests pressed forward, hoping that each session would finally bring the deliverance they sought. Toward the end of the exorcisms, Anneliese's moments of clarity became fewer and far between. Her speech slowed, her movements were weak and uncoordinated, and her eyes, once bright with determination, grew distant. Yet she never expressed regret for what she had endured. In her rare lucid moments, she whispered to her parents and the priests that she was ready for the end, whatever that might mean. By June 1976, Anneliese Michel's body was ravaged from months of relentless exorcisms and physical exhaustion. Her frame was skeletal, her movements slow and unsteady. Yet, despite her weakened state, she clung to a fierce belief that the torment she endured had a higher purpose. Every breath she took felt like a battle, but Anneliese was certain that she was on the verge of liberation, that through suffering, she could achieve a form of spiritual victory. Her parents were filled with both hope and dread. They wanted to believe that the end was near, that their daughter would finally be free from the torment that had consumed her for years, but they also saw the toll it had taken. Anneliese could no longer walk without assistance, and speaking was a struggle. Still, whenever she had moments of lucidity, she insisted that the exorcisms continue. "I have to keep going," she whispered to her mother one night, her voice barely audible. "I'm almost there." The exorcism sessions became increasingly urgent, as the priests and her family sensed that they were running out of time. During one of the final rituals, Anneliese's body convulsed violently, her face twisted in pain. Yet, between these intense moments, she would sometimes flash a strange, serene smile, telling those around her that she could feel the darkness weakening. It was as if she believed that each moment of agony brought her closer to a divine release. On June 30th, 1976, the final exorcism session took place. Anneliese was too weak to kneel, so she lay on a mattress placed on the floor. Her parents, desperate and exhausted, held her hands, hoping against hope that this would be the moment of deliverance. Father Renz and Father Alt recited the exorcism prayers with steady determination, their voices filling the room with sacred verses. Anneliese's breathing was shallow, but she forced herself to respond to the prayers, whispering "yes" and "please stay with me" whenever she had the strength. Throughout the session, Anneliese's expressions alternated between anguish and moments of strange peace. At one point, she looked into her mother's eyes and murmured, "Mother, I'm afraid." Her mother stroked her hair, fighting back tears, assuring Anneliese that she was not alone. They all prayed that this would be the final battle, that the forces tormenting her would release their grip at last. Toward the end of the ritual, Anneliese's voice softened, and she said something that haunted those present for years to come. "Please, don't give up on me." But as the hours dragged on, her strength gave out. The session ended without the sense of triumph they had hoped for, and Anneliese, too weak to speak, closed her eyes and drifted into a restless sleep. The following morning, on July 1st, 1976, Anneliese Michel passed away quietly in her home. Her parents discovered her lifeless body and, in their grief, called the priests to inform them of her passing. Anneliese's frail frame, reduced to just over 60 pounds, was a tragic testament to the suffering she had endured. For her family and the priests, the overwhelming question was whether her death was a spiritual victory or an unbearable loss. The tragedy did not end with Anneliese's passing. In the months that followed, the case drew public attention, leading to an investigation that scrutinized the actions of her parents and the priests. Authorities questioned whether Anneliese's death could have been prevented had medical intervention been prioritized over religious rituals. Her parents and the priests were charged with negligent homicide, sparking a controversial trial that captivated the nation and raised difficult questions about the intersection of faith and mental health. During the trial, Anneliese's parents defended their decision, insisting that they had followed their daughter's wishes and had acted out of love and desperation. They described Anneliese as a willing participant in the exorcisms, someone who truly believed that her suffering had meaning. The priests, too, stood by their actions, explaining that they had exhausted every other option and that Anneliese herself had pleaded for the rituals to continue. Medical experts testified that Anneliese's condition was likely the result of untreated epilepsy and psychosis, worsened by the extreme stress of the exorcisms. But for those closest to Anneliese, the answer was more complicated. They believed that Anneliese's suffering could not be fully explained by medical terms, that something deeper had taken place, something beyond human understanding. In the end, the priests and Anneliese's parents were found guilty of negligent homicide but received suspended sentences, as the court acknowledged that they had acted out of a misguided sense of care and faith. The verdict left many unresolved questions. Was Anneliese a victim of untreated illness, or did she truly endure a spiritual trial? And if her suffering was real, did it accomplish the redemption she had hoped for? Anneliese's story remains both a cautionary tale and a source of reflection on the complexities of faith, mental health, and the human need for meaning. To this day, some view her as a tragic figure who was failed by the systems meant to help her, while others believe that she experienced a spiritual battle that few can understand. In the years following her death, her grave became a place of pilgrimage for those who believed in the possibility of miracles. Visitors left flowers, prayers, and messages, hoping that, in some way, Anneliese's suffering had opened a path to healing. But for her family and the priests who had stood by her, the story was one of profound loss, a reminder that sometimes the search for salvation can lead to unimaginable sacrifice. As we reach the end of this haunting story, we're left with more questions than answers. Was Anneliese a victim of her own mind, or did she truly confront forces beyond our understanding? Whatever the truth, her story remains a powerful reminder of the mysteries that lie just beyond our grasp. If this tale has left you with chills, don't forget to leave a comment, and subscribe to MrBallison for more spine-tingling stories like this one. And remember, the darkness we fear may be closer than we think. Until next time, sleep well